I'm in the uncomfortable position of agreeing with more of what Michael said than what Julian said. And it's a little uncomfortable because my background is in physics and I'm a theoretical physicist by training. But I think it's reflective of an important point, that these things that we're talking about are extremely complicated and nuanced. And I hope to share with you a little bit some of my consternation and lack of understanding of these things. And I have to say, when Steve first asked me to do this, my first reaction was incredible joy, because he was asking me to talk about things like what is consciousness and what are souls, and can machines have them, and are we biological machines or something else? What does this mean for ethics, etc., etc. There was a long list, maybe about 12 different things, and I looked at that list and I said, this is exactly what every human should be thinking about, because they touch on every aspect of the human condition. But that joy was quickly replaced with dread and despair, because what I do in my day-to-day job is something very close to this, but I realize that I don't have any inkling how to answer any of those questions. So I was put in a little bit of a quandary, because I wanted to do a good job on this and say something new about all of these questions. And I tried. And what I found was that everything I could come up with which sounded definitive, like this is something that you should believe because it's clearly true, I couldn't find one single thing in any of this that was in that category. So what I decided to do instead was to tell you, not give you answers to all of these questions, but instead tell you some things that flavor the way I think about these problems. So I'm going to tell you about my thought process. And maybe here and there I'll say some specific things about what this means. Before I do that though, just as a little bit of background to sort of understand where I'm coming from. I've been a technology developer all my life. So what I've done in my entire professional life since I left school is build things. I'm addicted to building things. And the kinds of things I like to build are things that don't exist. So the things that I really get turned on thinking about are wild things not incompatible with science or the possibility that they could be built, but are so strange and interesting that you feel like devoting your life to building something like this could matter. So the first thing I did was try to build a machine called a quantum computer. And now spin out, I suppose, of my research when I was in grad school. Quantum computer is a computer that uses quantum mechanics, the fundamental language of nature, at least some think, to compute. So I did that for about 15 years. But I had an epiphany somewhere along that trajectory that computers are just machines that answer questions. And the more important thing was, who's asking the questions? And computers, at least as they're currently constituted, don't ask questions. So I decided that what I wanted to do instead was try to figure out, could you build a machine like an animal? So all biological animals share certain properties. Can you build a machine like that? And so I built a machine that was a little bit like an animal. This was my second company that used something called reinforcement learning in the process of making robots move. But that wasn't really what I wanted to do. What I really wanted to do was build people. So what I've been doing now for the last couple years is trying to understand what makes us human. And not in some theoretical sense, but practically. If I want to build a human, what do I need to know? What properties does this technological artifact have to count as a person? Okay, so I've got three things that I want to go through. Again, these are, call them flavors or colors of thought. They're things that I believe are probably true, that ground our thinking, make us clear about certain things that are probably correct. So the first one, I want you to think about family trees. This is the family tree of the royal family in England, or at least a part of it. And you see at the bottom there's these 6 children. And if you trace back their ancestry through their parents, you ultimately come up to Queen Elizabeth II and Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. And those two individuals have an interesting and unique property in this family tree, is that they're what's called the most recent common ancestor of all those 6 kids at the bottom. And all that means is that every single one of those 6 children has a great-grandmother named Queen Elizabeth II. They share a common ancestor. All right? Good? Because this is going to go from really obvious to really not obvious very quick. Okay, so what I want you to do now, it's audience participation time, is if you're on this side, I want you to look 2 seats over and look at the person. And if you're on this side, I want you to look 2 seats over and look at that person. I want you to ask yourself, are you related to them? And what I mean by that is there a Queen Elizabeth somewhere in your family trees that you share? So a great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother that maybe you share. Now, how many of you think that if you go back far enough, there is such a person? Show of hands. Okay. So what science says is that not only is that true, not only are Steve and I related, maybe 11th cousins, who knows, but even more amazing, that if you go back far enough, there's a single individual, a single person, or maybe pair, that's unlikely, but it could be, but one person, who is the most recent common ancestor of every single human on the planet. So what that means, if it's true, is that we're all related. Every human on the planet shares a lineage from one single individual, which is mind-blowing. And it could be as early as the time of Alexander the Great, about 300 BC, which is shocking. How could it be so early? But some of the models say that it could be that early. But if it isn't, it doesn't matter. You just keep going back and eventually you'll find them. Okay, that's pretty cool because it means we're all kin. We're all related. All right, now let's take it one step further. How many of you, okay, I'm not going to ask that, but all of you who have a dog or a cat at home, I want you to picture your dog or your cat, your specific dog or cat. All right? Turns out that my cat Fluffy and I have a common ancestor. If you go back far enough, my great, maybe 70 million greats grand ancestor is shared between me and my cat. And in fact, it seems pretty clear that all placental mammals, all mammals who have a placenta, are all related. And it's probably true that it was a little animal that lived in the trees and ate bugs. And again, this isn't a species thing, it's an individual, which is really mind-blowing. One little guy, one of those little insect-eating guys, is a common ancestor of every single placental mammal that's currently on the earth. So, we are all kin. And, by the way, keep doing this. All living things on the planet share common ancestry. We're all related. One large stream through time of forking and branching and dying and forking and branching and dying to where we are today. All right? Okay. Now, that's something we share, which is really important because I think a lot of questions that we want to ask about ourselves need to ground in the fact that we're not different, not so different, than a banana. Because if you go back long enough, that banana and you have a common ancestor. But of course, we're not exactly the same as all other animals. No animal is. And one way you can think about different species is that all species have something special. So, if you think about this little bird, again, I don't mean the category of bird, I mean that particular bird. That particular bird has an unbroken chain of successful reproduction going back all the way to the beginning of life on Earth. Its mom had a mom, its mom had a mom, its mom had a mom for 1 billion years, give or take. So that little bird is an amazing thing. It somehow managed, through all those millions of years, billions of years, to get to the point of still being around now. So this little guy, well, he's a memory that seems to outstrip the size of his little brain. He can bury up to 5,000 caches of nuts in the summer. The snow falls on top, he can find them all. And also he can fly, which we can't do. So what about us? So we've got a bunch of things that make us different. But the main one that we probably all agree is the one we need to focus on is what happens inside our heads. So we have this amazing thing that we do where the world outside of us is very big. This room, say, is much bigger than my head. But somehow, in some real sense, I have the room inside my head. And it's not just the room, it's the city. And it's not just the city, it's the country. It's not just the country, I can think of the whole planet. In fact, I can think on the scale of solar systems or maybe even galaxies. And all that stuff, not just at one instant of time, but maybe over a period of decades, I can think about. So how is this possible? And what I want to point out is the size. So my head's small. Well, not too small. It's small. Small compared to all that. How is it possible that all that's in here? And what's come to be understood in the cutting edge of modern AI is that there is a really interesting, fascinating answer to this. And it has to do with the fact that the world has patterns, structure. So you may be familiar with fractals. So fractals look very complicated, but they're generated by a tiny little thing that you can write down in a few numbers. And the world is like this. Images, like natural images, like what I'm looking at, have so much structure that they can be shrunk and compressed into a very tiny, what AI people call representation. So what our brains seem to do is build a very, very good compressed representation of the world. Call it a model. So just like if I have a building and there's like a blueprint or a scale model of the building, imagine I have the whole world and all of its concepts and I shrink it down into this weird compressed representation so that it fits inside my brain. So the modern view of intelligence, or call it cognition more generally, is that it's a very important thing that we create models of the world inside our heads, and everything you think, everything, from your feeling of self to the feeling that you may have a soul or a maker, to your preference for cilantro or not, all of those things live inside a place which is dark and small and never sees the outside world. When we look through our eyes, there are photons hitting the outside of our face. They don't actually make it into the part that thinks. The part that thinks is looking at something else. It's looking at some kind of weird compressed signal. And this is really, really, really important because something that Michael said, which is true, that the main thing that distinguishes us from all the other animals is not really language per se, because other animals make sounds with their mouth parts and communicate, like birds, cats, they do that. But something else is that we have the ability to model the world so well that we can develop abstract concepts that are not specific things. So if I were to say, hey, Bob, there's a lion behind that rock over there. That's a concrete thing. And Bob can be like, okay, I won't go over there. But if I say, hey, Bob, there's a nation called make up a name, some country over there, and everybody who belongs to that country, they're all going to kill you if you go over there. That's different. Because now you're not talking about a specific lion and a specific rock, you're talking about an imaginary thing, which is a nation. Nations are myths. They don't exist. They're shared delusions. They live at this level of abstraction above the concrete. If I ask you to hold a nation in your hand, you can't, because there is no such thing as a nation. A nation is a myth that we hold. And this quote is a little bit disturbing. I put it up there because it illustrates a point, but Harari is way too hard on this idea in the way that he describes it. Because just because something is an abstract concept, call it a myth, a thing that doesn't have tangible existence in the world, that does not mean it's not important, and it doesn't mean that it's not real. So let's take the soul. Okay, I will give that the soul, as it's currently constituted, may not actually be a thing. But, this is where the complexity happens. We have an idea, we have a concept, an abstract thing that we can talk about as a group and understand as a shared collective of this thing. That is real, but it's real in a very strange sense. It's real in the sense that they are patterns in our brains. So this thing that our brain does can create these patterns, all right? Now that's not nearly enough to make it what we might want to think of as real, but let's get to the third part, technology. Okay, so humans build things, and the best description that I've ever read of what humans do when they build technology was written by this guy, Kevin Kelly, in this article. You can find it online. I highly recommend everyone read it if you want to understand at least how I think about technology. The Technium is this idea that it's the sum total of all of the things that humans have ever built. So all of our stuff. For example, this room would count as part of the Technium. And obviously things like cell phones and cars and computers would count also. Now as humanity evolved from that furry bug-eating dude all the way up through your shared common ancestor into where we are today, over time we've added to this thing called the Technium, and humans are peculiar in that we are not separate from the things that we build. And those things that we build come from the abstract concepts that we share. So when you build a piece of stuff today, you never do it by yourself. You do it with others, in a company, as a team, and that thing needs to be defined. And when you build something new, it doesn't exist, like the soul. When we first started D-Wave, there were no quantum computers like the soul. They didn't exist, but there was an understanding that was shared amongst a whole bunch of people about what the world could look like if we built this thing that we all shared, all right? Now, the question about AI and where all this, what this means for us in the future. So I take it as almost certain that someday we will build a machine, a category of machine, maybe something a little bit like what we're building at Sanctuary, maybe something that looks quite different. But that machine will be able to do everything every human could do way better than any human. So everything, not just some things, but all things. I take it for granted that that is a future that will come to pass because it seems like it's possible, enough people want to do it, there are all sorts of motivations, economic and otherwise, this will happen. But some people think that just because a thing is better than you at everything, it's a threat. But that's not true. And it's not true for a very specific technical reason in AI, that when you build a machine, there are two things that are different. They're orthogonal. They don't interact with each other at all. One of them is the ability of the machine to do a job, but the other is its motivation. And motivation is something we don't usually ascribe to machines because most of the machines that we've built so far don't have it, at least not in a way that would be recognizable. You can kind of think of a toaster really wanting to make toast, but that's not really true. It's just a mechanism you push down makes toast. But let's say your children. So your children are not like a toaster at all. Your children have motivations and desires, and they want to do things that maybe you don't think are right. And increasingly, our technology will look like our children. They'll be reckless and not understand that if they put their hand on a burner, they're going to burn themselves and so on. So the key question that I think that I've kind of come around to is that this question about what humans are is a really difficult one to answer. because it changes over time. It's not the same as it was 200 years ago, and in 200 years it'll be different. But I think what we really want to know, at least on the AI side, is what do we want our future to look like? So when we build our descendants, which is essentially what we do when we build machines, when we build our machine children, what do we want them to be like? That's the key question. And it's very, very difficult to know, because any answer that you give is unsatisfactory in some way or another. And this is the one that I really struggle with. If you could build anything you wanted, what would it be? By the way, I could build, I think, a soul. Here's how I would do it. I copy you exactly into a digital environment. Everything about you. Imagine that was possible. It probably is. So if I copy you into a machine, that copy process has all of the properties we were talking about as being a soul. First of all, it's immaterial, because copying, that's not a thing, it's a process. It's immortal. It's just like you. You can put it in any environment you want, heaven, hell, make a simulation. So, all of these things that reside in our heads, these abstract concepts, I think that eventually we can build them, and we have to decide what we want to build, which is the really hard question. Kevin ends this with this statement, is that think of our technology like a teenager leaving the home. Right now, he's living with us, and sometimes we don't like him very much, but eventually he's going to leave, and we better make sure that we've taught him the right things, because he's not going to listen to us shortly. All right, thank you.